Have you ever stopped to think about, how deep the roots of American identity actually go, or how the foundations of our society were laid down, often in ways that are, well, way more varied and complex than the simple stories we sometimes hear? Today we're doing a deep dive into colonial America, specifically that stretch from 1607 to 1754. This era, it's more than just dates on a timeline. It's really where the seeds of our economy, our culture, our social structures were first planted. So our mission today is to cut through some of that noise, pull out the key insights from the historical sources we've looked at, and help you understand just how different the European powers were in their approach to colonization. And then how the British colonies developed their own distinct identities, and what kind of lasting legacies came out of this really pivotal time right up to the edge of revolution.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here is realizing these weren't just isolated events happening randomly. These early colonial patterns, they weren't accidental. They really laid the groundwork for, well, almost everything that followed. From our economy today to our core ideas about liberty, we're going to see how these incredibly different goals led to vastly different societies. It's a real mosaic.
It's funny, when we think early America, our minds often jump straight to the British, right? But this wasn't just a British show at the start, was it? This period saw like a whole mix of European powers trying to stake their claim, each with wildly different aims. Let's take the Spanish, for example. What was their main driver? What got them across the Atlantic?
Well, for the Spanish, their motive was almost single-minded: wealth, primarily digging for gold and silver. But it wasn't just that. They also had this strong religious mission, Christianizing native populations through these extensive mission systems. And to make that happen, they set up the encomienda system, which was frankly a really brutal way to exploit native labor. When disease and native resistance started making that difficult, they pretty quickly shifted towards using enslaved Africans instead.
And their interactions with indigenous peoples, how did that usually play out? Was it always conflict?
It was often violent, yeah, and very hierarchical. Their main focus was conversion, subjugation, basically folding native peoples into their rigid social structure. That definitely led to significant pushback. The Pueblo Revolt is probably the most famous example. Geographically, their reach was huge: Southwest US, Mexico, Florida, big parts of the Caribbean, South America. And they introduced this incredibly rigid caste system based purely on racial ancestry, which put natives and later Africans right at the bottom.
Okay, so a very top-down, extractive approach, heavy on conversion. How did that stack up against, say, the French?
Oh, a complete contrast, really. The French had entirely different goals. You see, their main aim wasn't resource extraction in the same way. It was much more centered on trade: furs, fish, that sort of thing. This meant they didn't focus so much on huge settlements or bringing over vast numbers of enslaved people. Actually, relatively few Europeans migrated to New France.
And what kind of relationship did that encourage with the native communities then?
Generally much more cooperative than the Spanish or later the British. To secure those vital trade alliances, intermarriage was pretty common. We see this with groups like the Ojibwe. The French might provide things like iron cookware or tools, and the Ojibwe offered their expertise in preparing beaver pelts. It was more symbiotic, driven by that trade. Their territory ended up stretching across Canada, the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi Valley. Quebec, founded in 1608, was key.
Interesting how the economic driver really shaped the whole interaction.
Okay.
Okay, what about the Dutch? Where did they fit in this picture? What was their main thing?
The Dutch, almost entirely commercial, they were all about setting up trading posts for economic gain. Think of the Dutch West India Company, pure business. Like the French, they focused on smaller trading settlements, not huge agricultural colonies, so their labor system wasn't built around mass enslavement either.
So let's focus on big settlements or trying to convert people.
Yeah.
How did that impact their dealings with Native Americans?
Exactly. Their relationships were almost exclusively about trade, so fewer large-scale conflicts compared to others. They really had no interest in converting native peoples. Their main claims were around New Amsterdam, which of course became New York, and up the Hudson River Valley.
Yeah,
Henry Hudson, that was their guy.
right. And then we finally get to the British. Their goals seem like maybe a bit of a mix, but with this really strong emphasis on permanent settlement.
Absolutely, that's the key difference: permanent settlements. And that was driven by a few things happening at once. Economic opportunity. For sure, you had joint stock companies funding places like Jamestown in 1607, but also this relentless hunger for land. A lot of that was fueled by the enclosure movement back in England, which was pushing peasants off the land, creating this landless population looking for somewhere to go. And of course, religious freedom is a big one. Think of the Puritans escaping persecution, landing in America after finding Holland wasn't quite right for them either, often for economic reasons, too.
And that drive for land, for permanent homes, how did that shape their approach to labor and, crucially, to the native populations already there?
It changed everything, fundamentally. Labor-wise, they started with indentured servants, but, and this is critical, they increasingly shifted to African slavery, especially down south. And unlike the French or Dutch, British settlers often came over as family units, looking to build entirely new societies from scratch. Their relations with Native Americans, often tense, often violent. The Powhatan Wars, the Pequot War, Metacom's War, these are just some examples. These settlers didn't just want resources, they wanted the land itself. And their approach was generally to expel native populations, not integrate or subjugate them like the Spanish tried to do. They set up shop all along the Atlantic coast, New England, the middle colonies, the southern colonies. And here's something really distinct. They also developed these early, pretty robust self-governing institutions. The Virginia House of Burgesses in 1619, the New England town meetings, that's quite unique. So if we tie this all together, you can really see how these different imperial goals didn't just shape economies. They basically coded different civic DNA into each region. The Spanish quest for gold led to that rigid caste system. The French focus on trade meant alliances. But the British pursuit of land and permanent settlement, that created a totally different dynamic with native peoples and with labor, laying these very distinct foundations that influenced everything from rights to identity in ways we still see today.
Okay, so we've got the British established, but even within that British colonial project, there was this fascinating internal variety developing, wasn't there? Something that would really define American regions for centuries. Even though they were all technically under the British crown, these colonies were incredibly different. Environment, why people came, what they grew, it all created these distinct regional identities, almost like separate little countries. Let's start up north, New England. What was its defining character?
New England was very much shaped by its founders, mostly Puritans. Their main vision wasn't about hitting it big with a cash crop. Instead, they were intensely focused on building this tight-knit religious community, a society based on family-run farms and businesses.
Right.
So their economy was pretty diverse, subsistence farming, yes, but also significant shipbuilding, fishing, trade, not the big plantations you saw elsewhere.
And their way of governing that was pretty distinctive too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It revolved around these highly participatory town meetings. It really mirrored their church structure, self-governing congregations. You see that spirit in early documents like the Mayflower Compact. It was a very local, very communal form of self-rule.
That's a really interesting contrast. So
Yeah.
while other powers might be imposing control from the top down, the British in New England were sort of accidentally maybe planting seeds for local control and direct participation. Okay, moving south a bit, the middle colonies. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. How did they compare?
The middle colonies were much more of a melting pot. You had incredible ethnic and religious diversity right from the start. Think about Pennsylvania with William Penn and the Quakers. He actively promoted religious freedom for everyone and even tried to negotiate fairly for land with native tribes. Economically, they were booming. They became the breadbasket, exporting huge amounts of grain. Plus, they had major port cities like Philadelphia and New York driving commerce. But that success also led to something else. The rise of an elite class, merchants mostly, and over time, growing inequality. You had wealthy merchants, artisans, unskilled workers, and enslaved Africans all part of that mix.
And then we get to the Chesapeake and the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and also the British West Indies, which were hugely important. Here, the economy took a very different turn, pushing society in a drastically different direction.
You're absolutely right. Down south, and especially in the Caribbean, the economy was built almost entirely on labor-intensive cash crops. Tobacco, as you mentioned, saved Jamestown early on, thanks to John Rolfe. Later, rice and especially sugarcane became dominant, particularly in places like Barbados and the West Indies, where the climate was perfect for it. And that kind of agriculture demanded a huge labor force. Initially, they relied on indentured servants, but the shift towards relying almost entirely on enslaved Africans happened relatively quickly and became incredibly entrenched.
And how did that massive reliance on enslaved labor shaped their governance and their whole social structure.
It shaped everything. A wealthy planter elite came to dominate local politics, and the elected assemblies, like Virginia's House of Burgesses, they held the power. And it's really crucial to understand that the strict slave codes they developed, laws that defined enslaved people as property, as chattel, and controlled every single aspect of their lives, were heavily influenced by the brutal systems already perfected on the sugar plantations in the British West Indies. It really makes you ask, how did such fundamentally different societies grow up under the same British flag? And the answer seems to lie in those specific conditions and the choices made right at the beginning. From the Puritan ideal of a city upon a hill to the sheer economic logic, however brutal, of cash crop agriculture that just consumed labor, it's profound, really, how these different colonial blueprints, New England's focus on community versus the South's pursuit of wealth through forced labor, basically set the stage for divisions that would tear the nation apart later. You can almost see the fault lines of the Civil War forming back in these early decisions.
So we've got these diverse colonies developing. Let's zoom out again. What did this all mean for the bigger economic picture? These places weren't isolated. They were plugged into this huge global network. At the center was this idea of the transatlantic economy, often called the triangular trade. Can you walk us through that journey?
Sure. So imagine this three-legged voyage connecting continents. Often, a ship might start in New England, loaded with rum. It sails to West Africa, trades that rum for captured Africans. Those enslaved people then endure the horrific Middle Passage, a journey where estimates suggest maybe 500,000 died just during the transport to the British colonies alone. They arrive in the British West Indies, are traded for sugarcane or molasses. That sugar then gets shipped back to New England to be distilled into more rum, and the triangle starts again.
It was incredibly brutal, but also incredibly profitable for those involved.
And underpinning this whole system was a dominant economic theory, right? Mercantilism. What exactly was that, and how did it shape how nations acted? Right. Mercantilism was the name of the game back then. The core idea was basically that there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world, mostly measured in gold and silver. So every nation was essentially competing to get the biggest possible piece of that pie. The main goal: maintain a favorable balance of trade. You wanted to export more than you imported so that gold and silver flowed into your country, not out.
So colonies weren't just distant lands. They played a really specific, calculated role in this system.
Exactly. They were crucial for two main reasons. They provided raw materials that the home country couldn't produce itself, and they served as guaranteed markets for the home country's manufactured goods. To make sure Britain got the maximum benefit, Parliament passed laws like the Navigation Acts. These basically said trade had to be on English ships, and certain valuable goods, like tobacco, had to go through England first to be taxed. It was all designed to channel wealth back to Britain.
And this system, it obviously generated huge wealth for certain groups: merchants, investors, plantation owners. It also turned places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia into major urban centers. Those two things together kind of sparked what historians call a consumer revolution, didn't they? More money meant people bought more stuff, and status started shifting from just who your family was to how much wealth you had and the kind of lifestyle you could afford.
Absolutely. But it's vital to remember this system wasn't just about economics. It fundamentally reshaped societies on three continents. That fixed wealth idea fueled intense competition and conflict between European powers. And the triangular trade, while enriching some, was built on an almost unimaginable human cost. It also, tragically, acted as a superhighway for diseases, spreading epidemics that devastated populations, especially Native American communities, changing demographics and power balances forever.
Okay, beyond the economics, let's talk about the day-to-day reality. Early settlers were constantly interacting with the people already living on the land. These relationships were incredibly complex, sometimes accommodation, often brutal conflict. You mentioned earlier the different European approaches. How did that play out specifically with American Indian nations?
It really varied dramatically. The French and the Dutch, as we said, were generally less invasive. Their focus was trade, especially furs, so they often saw native groups as essential partners, even military allies. Intermarriage was common, a way to cement those trade relationships.
And the British, you said, they mostly aimed to expel natives, but you do hear about initial exchanges, like learning farming techniques. Was there ever a period of genuine, maybe attempted peaceful coexistence, or was conflict almost baked in from their goal of permanent settlement?
That's a great question. Yes, particularly in early New England, there was an initial phase of, let's say, cautious coexistence, some exchange of goods for knowledge. But it just wasn't sustainable given the British model. The sheer number of settlers arriving, their constant demand for more land, It inevitably led to friction, encroachment, and displacement. Unlike the Spanish, who tried to incorporate natives into their system, albeit at the bottom, the British generally thought to push them out entirely. The Spanish approach, remember, fundamentally altered native societies through missions and that caste system, especially around places like Santa Fe, which they founded back in 1610.
All these different interactions led to really complex webs of alliances and conflicts. European powers would arm native groups to fight rivals, and native groups would ally with Europeans against other native groups. For the British, clashes over land and resources were frequent. Can you give us a major example of that kind of conflict?
Yes, a really significant one is Metacom's War, sometimes called King Philip's War in New England from 1675 to 1678. Chief Metacom, or Philip as the English called him, saw the threat British expansion posed. He managed to build a powerful alliance of tribes and launch these devastating attacks against colonial settlements. Ultimately, the colonists, with help from the Mohawk Nation, crushed the uprising. But it was incredibly bloody and really hardened the English view that expulsion was the only way forward. So you see American Indian groups constantly adapting, making alliances, migrating, trying to navigate this new reality. But we also see powerful acts of resistance. The Pueblo Revolt in 1680 out of New Mexico is just a stunning example. The Pueblo people united and actually drove the Spanish out completely for 12 years. And while the Spanish eventually came back, the revolt showed that determined resistance could force concessions. The Spanish actually had to accommodate Pueblo culture to some degree afterwards, which is quite remarkable.
Now, we have to talk about one of the most profound and, frankly, devastating developments of this whole era, the institution of slavery. It's so important to grasp that this wasn't just a Southern thing. All the British colonies were involved to different degrees in the Atlantic slave trade. The scale is just mind-boggling. Maybe 3 million captive Africans brought to British North America and the Caribbean, and perhaps 500,000 dying just on the Middle Passage voyage. The sheer brutality of chattel slavery is hard to comprehend, isn't it?
It truly is, and it raises the question of how quickly those laws developed that turned people into property. The demand for enslaved labor grew out of a few key factors converging. You had all this land, especially land suitable for labor-intensive cash crops. You had growing demand in Europe for things like tobacco and sugar. And critically, the system of using indentured servants just wasn't providing enough labor. It wasn't sustainable long-term.
And wasn't there a specific event in Virginia that acted as a real catalyst, pushing the elite towards relying more heavily on African slavery?
Yes, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. That was absolutely pivotal. You had these disgruntled former indentured servants, mostly poor whites, teaming up with enslaved Africans to rebel against the governor and the planter elite. This terrified the ruling class. The idea of poor whites and enslaved Africans making common cause against them was their worst nightmare. So a major consequence was that the elite consciously decided to lean much more heavily on African slavery. It created a more easily controlled workforce, and crucially, it drove a wedge between poor whites and enslaved blacks based on race, making future alliances less likely.
And while slavery touched all the colonies, its concentration really varied geographically, didn't it?
Hugely. Generally, the further south you went, the more central slavery became. The British West Indies, with the massive sugar plantations, imported the largest numbers by far. Then the Chesapeake and southern colonies relied heavily on enslaved labor for tobacco and rice. In the middle colonies, you'd find enslaved people working on farms, but also as domestic servants or artisans in cities. New England had the fewest enslaved people working on farms, but merchants and ship owners were deeply involved in the slave trade. And importantly, in all the major port cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, there were significant numbers of enslaved people working on the docks, in workshops, as blacksmiths. It really permeated the entire economy. And the type of slavery that developed was chattel slavery. That meant enslaved people were legally defined not as humans with rights, but as property, like livestock, chattel. This was heavily influenced by practices already established in the British West Indies. The laws became incredibly harsh over time. They made slavery hereditary. If your mother was enslaved, you were too. They explicitly gave owners the power of life and death. They banned black people from owning weapons, from traveling without permission, banned interracial marriage, all designed to create and enforce this rigid race-based hierarchy and maintain absolute control.
But even under this unimaginable oppression, enslaved people constantly pushed back. They resisted in both hidden, covert ways and sometimes through open, overt rebellion. What did that covert resistance look like?
Covert resistance was about survival, maintaining humanity and community. It could be things like secretly keeping alive African languages, naming practices, spiritual beliefs, passing them down. It could also mean slowing down the pace of work, pretending not to understand instructions, breaking tools, damaging crops, small acts that disrupted the system and asserted some agency.
And then there were the overt rebellions, the direct challenges to the system. Can you tell us about one of the most significant ones?
Yes, overt resistance, though incredibly dangerous, did happen. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 is a major example. A group of enslaved men, likely Congo warriors with military experience, broke into a store, seized weapons, killed the owners, and started marching south toward Spanish Florida, where they'd been promised freedom. They gathered more followers, burned plantations, killed more white colonists along the way. The colonial militia eventually caught up and brutally suppressed the rebellion. But Stono sent shockwaves through the colonies. It shattered any illusions of contented slaves and showed the constant, desperate desire for freedom and the lengths people would go to achieve it. This whole system, chattel slavery, it wasn't just an economic system. It was a deliberate, racialized social structure built to maintain power. And that resistance, both quiet and loud, is just a powerful testament to the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished.
So as these colonies are growing and developing these distinct characteristics, something else is happening. They're not just becoming little Englands. A new sort of American culture is starting to bubble up. It's shaped by this mix of different European groups, new ideas floating across the Atlantic, religious fervor, and just the day-to-day experience of living in this new place.
Yeah.
And all this starts creating some real friction with Britain. The sheer diversity of European settlers, different religions, different ethnicities, naturally fostered a kind of pluralism, an exchange of ideas that you maybe wouldn't find back in a more homogenous England.
And layered on top of that, you have the Enlightenment sweeping across the Atlantic. These ideas about reason, natural rights, the social contract, they're arriving through books, pamphlets, letters. Thinkers like John Locke, his ideas about life, liberty, and property, and that governments exist to protect those rights, and if they don't, people can change them. That resonated deeply with colonists. Plus, ideas from Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu about checks and balances. It gave people an intellectual toolkit for questioning authority.
And running parallel to that wave of reason, you had this huge wave of religious emotion sweeping the colonies to the Great Awakening. How did that fit into this emerging identity?
Yeah, the Great Awakening was this massive colonies-wide religious revival. It cut across regional and class lines. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards, famous for that sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and George Whitefield, who was like a rock star preacher touring the colonies, emphasized this intense personal connection to God. They also stressed more democratic elements within Christianity, challenging established church hierarchies. It gave ordinary people a sense of spiritual importance and, some historians argue, a kind of biblical ballast, a moral justification for questioning authority, whether it was religious or political. It definitely fostered a shared American experience.
Okay, so you've got these powerful intellectual and spiritual currents creating a shared identity, but also maybe contributing to this growing sense of difference, of divergence from Britain and resistance to imperial control. Because while the colonies were becoming more English, in some ways drinking tea, reading English books, they were also developing these really strong traditions of local self-government, as you mentioned, fueled by trade links between colonies and that print culture spreading ideas around.
Exactly. And this is where the friction really ramps up. The goals of the leaders back in London and the goals of the colonists on the ground started to diverge more and more. There was growing mistrust over things like how the Western territories should be settled, who was responsible for frontier defense, how much self-rule the colonies should have, and who controlled trade. So the roots of colonial resistance, the stuff that boils over later, you can trace it back here, to those traditions of local government. The new ideas about liberty from the Enlightenment, the sense of religious independence from the Great Awakening, and just this growing feeling that imperial policies were often corrupt or didn't serve colonial interests.
You know, a really concrete example of that friction was the British Navy's practice of impressment, basically grabbing sailors off merchant ships or even out of pubs and forcing them into service. How did colonists react to that?
They hated it. They saw it as a fundamental violation of their rights as Englishmen, their right to liberty. The British Navy, on the other hand, saw it as a necessary evil to man the fleet. This came to a dramatic head in Boston in 1747 with the impressment riots. Colonists rioted for 3 days, basically holding the city, furious about sailors being seized. It wasn't just a small protest, it showed a real willingness to physically resist imperial actions they saw as violations of their fundamental rights. So this whole period, it's this fascinating push and pull. The colonies are becoming more British in some ways, but also developing this distinct American identity. And the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening are providing the language, the justification for the ideas of liberty and resistance that are about to become incredibly important.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway for you listening today? How did these foundational years really set the stage for the America we know? We've journeyed through the competing visions of empires, the incredibly diverse economies, the complex social structures, the interactions, the conflicts.
I think the key thing is just how complex and varied those roots are. American identity wasn't monolithic from the start. It was woven from all these different cultural threads, intense economic competition, and these ongoing struggles for power, for land, and, crucially, for freedom. It's a story full of contradictions and unexpected turns.
Okay, here's something to chew on. Given how incredibly different the colonies were from the start, their motivations, their economies, their societies, and given the often brutal systems they created, was the break from Britain almost baked in from the beginning? Or could things have gone differently? Could a unified American identity have actually formed and maybe even flourished under continued British rule? It's a really interesting question to ponder.